The sea had been restless all day, as if sensing what was coming long before any man aboard the ship could. Gray waves slapped against the steel hull with a rhythm that felt more like a warning than a tide. Clouds gathered low and heavy on the horizon, swallowing the sun long before dusk. The air tasted of salt and cold iron. Even the gulls had vanished. The crew moved across the deck with the quiet focus of men who understood that the ocean was the one enemy they could never outgun. Boots thudded on wet metal. Ropes strained under growing winds. A distant tremor rolled through the ship, the vibration of waves beginning to rise with unseen force. Somewhere, deep below, the engines groaned like an old beast awakening. The captain stood at the bow, staring into a horizon that no longer had a line. Sea and sky had merged into a single shifting mass of darkness. He had fought through battles, seen ships break apart under fire, watched friends vanish beneath smoke and flame. But nothing he had faced had the certainty of this. A storm does not aim nor hesitate. It simply consumes. A sudden gust tore across the deck, ripping loose a tarp and sending it tumbling into the churning water below. The wind began to howl, not as a voice, but as a force, a wild and merciless thing. Men turned their faces away, squinting through the spray that slammed against them. Somewhere, deep inside every one of them, fear curled tight like a fist. The first raindrops struck the deck like cold stones. Lightning carved a jagged scar across the sky, revealing the shape of the storm in a single brief flash, a towering wall of darkness that seemed to rise from the sea itself. No man on board would forget that moment, because that was when they realized the storm was coming for them, and there was nowhere to run. The first tremors reached the ship long before the men felt any fear. A deep, rhythmic thudding rose from beneath the hull. The kind of vibration that came not from machinery, but from the sea itself, shifting with unease. Water slapped harder against the bow, each impact stronger, heavier, as if the ocean were drawing breath for something much greater. Sailors paused in their tasks and glanced over the rails, staring into a surface that had begun to twist in strange, uneasy patterns. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened into a heavy curtain of charcoal clouds. Wind whipped across the deck, tearing at clothes and biting at exposed skin. The scent of rain mixed with the metallic tang of the ship, creating an air thick with tension. Officers paced with growing urgency, voices raised not in panic, but in the steady tone of men who understood the danger rising around them. The storm was approaching faster than any forecast had dared to predict. As the first sheets of cold rain struck the deck, the sea grew wild beneath them. Swells rose like the backs of enormous beasts, lifting the ship and dropping it again with thundering force. Lanterns swung violently on their hooks, casting frantic shadows across the steel walls. The ship was no longer cutting through the water. It was being carried, pushed, pulled, and tested. And every man on board understood that the storm had only just begun. When the call to stations echoed across the deck, the men moved with the instinct of those who had drilled countless times, though none of their training had prepared them for this. The storm was already roaring, a monstrous wall of wind and water slamming into them from every direction. Rain struck like shards of glass. The deck tilted sharply, sending crates and ropes sliding violently across the floor as sailors fought to regain balance. The captain's voice cut through the chaos with a command to hold course. It sounded impossible. The sea wanted to tear them away, hurl them sideways, pull them under, yet the ship pressed forward. Each man clung to railings and ropes as the vessel groaned from bow to stern. Engineers fought to keep the engines alive, their hands slipping on wet controls as the ship shuddered with every monstrous wave. Minutes stretched like hours. The storm gave no reprieve, no pause, no rhythm, only relentless attacks from the sky and sea. The crew worked until their muscles burned, every action fueled not by bravery, but by sheer survival. The ship lurched violently again, and for a moment they believed it might flip. But it held, barely. Somehow, impossibly, it held. The storm reached a new fury as night fell, enveloping the ship in total darkness. Lightning flashed in violent streaks, illuminating waves that towered above the vessel like moving mountains. Each wave crashed with the force of 1,000 drums, shaking the steel beneath the men's feet. The wind screamed over the deck, ripping loose anything that wasn't bolted down. Then came the wave, the one the crew would never forget. It rose out of the darkness, as if the sea itself had reared up in anger. A wall of water, impossibly tall, surging toward the ship with unstoppable momentum. Men shouted warnings, bracing themselves against railings, their hearts pounding as the ocean charged at them with full force. The impact was like a collision with the world itself. Water roared over the bow, sweeping across the deck in a violent surge, knocking men off their feet and slamming them against steel. For several breathless seconds, the ship was buried beneath the wave, plunged into a crushing darkness. When it broke free again, gasping for air like a living creature, the deck was a wreck of overturned equipment, broken rails, and dazed sailors struggling to stand. But they were still afloat. Against all odds, they were still afloat. In the chaos of recovery, someone screamed a name, then another, then another. Men scrambled across the slick, broken deck, shouting into the darkness, searching every corner. A rope hung loose over the side, whipping wildly in the wind. A lantern rolled back and forth, its light flickering through water pooled across the floor. A sailor was missing. He had been standing near the bow when the wave hit, holding the line that snapped in the same instant the sea tore across the deck. No one had seen him fall. No one had heard him call for help. No one had been able to stop the force that pulled him away. The storm swallowed everything: sound, sight, hope. A group of men rushed to the rails, leaning over despite the risk of being swept away themselves. The ocean below churned violently, a writhing mass of black water that hid everything beneath its shifting surface. They called his name, though they knew the storm would not return what it had taken. The captain ordered them back, not in harshness, but in the voice of a man who understood the cruelty of the sea. Their first loss would not be their last. Far below the deck, where the roar of the storm became a muffled thunder, the engine room was fighting its own battle. Steam hissed from valves that strained under pressure. Metal groaned with every tilt of the ship. Water seeped in through cracks, dripping steadily onto the floor and pooling beneath the great machinery that kept the vessel alive. Engineers, soaked in sweat and seawater, worked with frantic precision. Tools clattered against steel as they tightened bolts, secured pipes, and adjusted gauges that trembled near the red. The engines were overheating, pushed beyond their limits as they fought the storm's powerful currents. Each shudder of the ship sent a ripple of fear across the men's faces. A loud crack echoed through the room, a pipe splitting under the strain. Scalding steam burst forth, filling the air with a blinding white cloud. Men dove away, shouting for tools, scrambling to patch the leak before it grew into something catastrophic. They knew that if the engines failed, the ship would be left helpless, and the storm would finish what it had started. They patched the pipe, barely, just barely. As the night deepened, the storm intensified into something almost unnatural. The sea heaved with a violence that defied understanding. Each wave slammed the ship sideways, sending it rolling so far that men clung to whatever they could find just to stay upright. Rain hammered the deck in solid sheets, turning every surface into a treacherous trap. Lightning crashed again and again, each strike lighting the sky with a harsh white glow, revealing a world swallowed by chaos. One bolt hit close, too close, sending a shockwave through the air that made men stagger. Another hit the water just off the port side, splitting the darkness with a violent roar. The crew no longer spoke. There was no time, no breath, no voice left for words. They moved like shadows, clinging to survival with raw instinct. Each man knew the truth that no one dared say aloud. They were no longer fighting the storm. They were enduring it, surviving it, being shaped by it. The night seemed endless. Sometime after midnight, a sound rose above the storm, a deep, sickening groan that vibrated through the entire ship. Men froze. They knew that sound, steel under stress, steel failing. The hull had taken too many blows. Wave after wave had hammered the same section with unrelenting fury. Now the metal buckled. A crack formed beneath the waterline, spreading slowly at first, then widening as the force of the sea pounded against it. Water surged in. Teams rushed below deck, slamming bulkhead doors shut, trying to contain the flooding. Pumps roared as they fought to expel the water pouring in. The corridors echoed with shouted orders and splashing footsteps. The ship tilted slightly to one side, just a few degrees, but every man felt it, a tilt that carried the weight of dread. The sea had found a way in. What followed was a desperate struggle not against the storm alone, but against the ship itself. Water surged through the compromised compartments, rising inch by inch as men worked to stop the flow. Wooden beams were forced against the crack, ropes tied so tightly they cut into the wood. Metal plates were hauled into place, hammered down in a frantic attempt to seal the breach. Every blow of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat, a timer counting down. Men waded through knee-deep water, their boots dragging with each step, their breath turning to steam in the cold. The pumps strained under the pressure, groaning like dying animals as they forced water back through the hull. At times, it looked hopeless. At times, it felt like the sea was simply toying with them, letting them believe they might win before crushing them entirely. But with every failing pump, with every makeshift patch, with every desperate command yelled through the noise, they held on. They held the ocean back, somehow, just enough. Even with the breach sealed, the storm refused to relent. A monstrous wave struck the port side, sending men tumbling across the deck. Another hit minutes later, snapping a lifeboat loose and sending it crashing into the rails before it was torn away entirely. A mast cracked with a deafening snap, crashing onto the deck like a falling tree. Sparks exploded as wires ripped free, scattering across the wet metal. Men leaped aside, slipping, falling, climbing again. The storm was dismantling the ship piece by piece, tearing away everything it could reach. The crew fought to keep the vessel balanced, adjusting ballast, shifting weight, desperately trying to stabilize the listing hull. With every crash of the waves, the ship groaned, a wounded giant struggling to stay upright. Water pooled across every surface, dragging equipment and men alike across the deck. The storm wasn't done with them. Not yet. Then, miraculously, the storm began to change. The wind softened. Not much, but enough to notice. The waves still towered, but they no longer struck with the same merciless fury. The sky remained dark, but the clouds shifted in slow, reluctant movements. The men felt the change immediately. It wasn't safety. It wasn't calm. It was simply less. A moment to breathe. A moment to understand they were still alive. Some collapsed against rails, panting. Others stood silent, staring into the endless black horizon as if trying to make sense of how they had survived so far. Their clothes were soaked, their hands numb, their bodies bruised. Tools lay scattered across the deck, some lost to the sea, others clinging precariously to corners. The ship still groaned under its own weight, but it held. It held. For the first time all night, there was hope. As dawn crept over the horizon, the full horror of the night revealed itself. The deck was shattered, railings bent and broken, equipment torn apart, pools of water reflecting the weary faces of the men who had endured the storm. The mast lay in splintered ruin. The hull bore deep scars where the ocean had beaten against it. Smoke drifted lazily from damaged machinery. Some men were missing, others were injured, stubbornly trying to work despite bleeding hands and trembling limbs. And yet, despite everything, the ship floated. The crew moved across the wreckage with a reverence usually reserved for graves. They counted the missing, tended to the wounded, and gathered what supplies remained. Their voices were quiet, their shoulders heavy. But beneath the exhaustion was something stronger. They had survived, and they had survived together. The storm passed fully by mid-morning, leaving the ocean eerily calm. Sunlight broke through the clouds in soft golden beams, turning the water into a shimmering field of silver. It felt impossible that such violence could give way to such peace. The captain stood at the bow, staring across the horizon with eyes that carried the weight of every loss and every miracle of the night. The surviving crew gathered behind him, silent, humbled, changed. They looked upon the calm sea not with relief but with understanding. The ocean had shown them its true power, and in return, they had shown it their resolve. A gentle breeze touched their faces. The ship creaked softly as it drifted forward, guided by the faint push of the tide. For now, the sea had let them go. But every man aboard knew the truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. No battle in the war would ever match the night they faced the storm. Because some enemies cannot be defeated, only endured.